Chapters 27 and 28 of Napoleon and Marie-Louise, The Fall of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This recording is in the public domain. 27. 1810 to 1811. Crisis of the Alliance. On the very eve of the outbreak of hostilities between France and Russia, the two emperors continued to express for each other the same sentiments of regard and even of affection. Alexander said to M. de Bray, the Bavarian minister, "I love the Emperor Napoleon like a brother. I think that I have inspired in him the same feelings, and you should count on a constant accord between our cabinets." Napoleon wrote Alexander, "Permit me to assure your Majesty that if destiny should render inevitable a war between us, it will not change in any respect the sentiments with which your Majesty has inspired me, and which are in no danger of change or alteration." At Paris the representatives of the Czar were treated better than any of the others, and if Napoleon occasionally showed some particular attentions to he at once explained it to Russia by saying that the health of Korakin made it impossible for him to receive the same favors. At St. Petersburg the Czar still displayed the same affectionate regard for Caulaincourt. The two governments also continued to observe the letter, if not the spirit, of the Treaty of Alliance. The ports of Russia remained closed to vessels flying the British flag, and Napoleon kept the Czar informed of all his negotiations with England, as if he wished to prove that he at least would never conclude a separate peace. Nevertheless, in spite of all these efforts to preserve the outward forms of a complete accord between the two courts, the situation was strained, and affairs had reached a point where the least additional pressure would break the bonds of the alliance. This rupture occurred when Napoleon wished to have Russia adopt the measures of extreme rigor against English commerce which he had imposed on his other allies. At the very moment when the plans of Napoleon had never been so near success, his ally failed him. The desperate condition of England at this time is clearly revealed in Green's History of the English People. The annexation of Holland, the closing of all the German ports, the rigorous surveillance of all the coasts, the confiscations of British goods wherever found upon the Continent, had caused enormous losses to English commerce. At London there were numerous failures. One by one commercial houses of the highest credit of European reputation were forced into bankruptcy. At the same moment, when the credit of England was thus shaken, the threat of war with the United States seemed about to close the last remaining outlet for British commerce. The enormous growth of the national debt, strikes of workmen, the dearness of corn, all combined to depress the people. The war had brought to England a period of unprecedented prosperity. The continuance of the conflict threatened to cause her ruin. In every section of the country there was want and misery, with the danger in the immediate future of universal distress, which might lead to a popular uprising and a class war. It is strange that Napoleon never prohibited the export of foodstuffs to England, a measure which would have reduced the nation to the direst extremities, and probably have forced the government to sue for peace. He seems to have had the idea that the more the British bought, the sooner they would become bankrupt. "The outlook would have been hopeless," writes Mr. Rose, "had not our great enemy allowed us to import continental corn. If, besides lack of work and low wages, there had been the added horrors of a bread famine." Napoleon was well informed of this situation through the abstracts of the English papers and the reports from his agents in London. The economic war appeared at the point of bringing him the results which all his victories from Austerlitz to Wagram had not achieved. The maritime peace, so ardently desired, so long sought, seemed almost within his grasp. On the Continent the only ports which remained open to English goods were those of Russia on the Baltic, where vessels flying a neutral flag, generally American, were allowed to discharge their cargoes. Some of this merchandise was consumed in Russia, but a large quantity, in immense caravans of 700 wagons at a time, was forwarded through Germany to every part of the Continent. If Russia continued to allow this commerce to enter, she would furnish England with the gold to maintain her credit, pay her troops in the Peninsula, and prolong the war indefinitely. On the other hand, if the Czar resolutely closed his ports to this commerce, Great Britain would quickly be brought to terms. The question of peace or war rested entirely in the hands of Russia. The private letters of Caulaincourt to Champagny at this time clearly show the courageous frankness of the ambassador, and reveal at the same time his blindness as to the real intentions of Alexander. In a remarkable letter sent to Caulaincourt by special courier, Champagny writes: "At this moment, when we are achieving the end for which so many sacrifices have been made, represent to the Russian government how important it is to the common cause, how necessary it is for Russia, who desires peace, to strike with France the last blow which must bring it about. Never has England found herself in such distress, and this distress is above all the result of the last measures taken by the Emperor. We know from reliable sources that the English commerce is ruined, and that the nation now wishes for peace, while a few months since it was indifferent to the continuation of the war. The Emperor attaches so much importance to this matter that he has desired me to make it the subject of a special letter which has passed under his eyes. And in having these measures adopted throughout the Russian Empire, you will have afforded His Majesty a new proof of the talent and the zeal which you give to his service." A few days after the dispatch of this letter, news was received at Paris of the appearance in the Baltic of an immense fleet of vessels loaded with English goods. Refused entrance at all the ports of Mecklenburg and Prussia, the convoy had set sail for Russia. At that time there was present in Paris the same Colonel Tchernicheff who during the campaign of 1809 had been sent to the French headquarters as a bearer of letters from the Czar. He had recently been sent again to Napoleon with the same mission. The Emperor took advantage of his presence at Fontainebleau, where the court was then in residence, to explain verbally, at great length, the French policy regarding England, and then placed in his hands a personal letter to Alexander, worded as follows: "Monsieur mon frère, your Imperial Majesty has sent me such handsome horses, that I do not wish to delay in expressing my thanks. The English are suffering greatly from the reunion of Holland, and the occupation which I have made of the ports of Mecklenburg and Prussia. Every week there are bankruptcies at London which produce confusion in the city. The factories are without work, the warehouses are overflowing. I have just seized at Frankfort and in Switzerland immense quantities of English and colonial merchandise. 600 British vessels which were wandering in the Baltic have been refused in Mecklenburg, also in Prussia, and have been directed toward the States of your Majesty. If you admit them, the war will still go on. If you sequester and confiscate their cargoes, the counterstroke which will be given England will be terrible. It depends upon your Majesty to have peace or to make the war continue. Peace is and should be your desire." For several days Napoleon had also been dissatisfied with the attitude of Sweden, who hesitated to break with England. The Russian envoy was accordingly charged also with a verbal message to the Czar, praying him to address a severe admonition to the Swedish government, demanding war on England, and the confiscation of British goods. The demands of Napoleon were not well received at St. Petersburg. The Czar was not willing to increase the misery of his people by prohibiting all commerce with England. Besides, he no longer desired to see the ruin of Great Britain, the last remaining barrier against the absolute domination of Napoleon in Europe. Rumenzoff had already notified Caulaincourt that Russia could not consent to the new measures of oppression. "The Emperor is disposed," he said, "to do England all the harm possible, but he cannot afford to do himself more harm than he does to the enemy." The Czar also said to the ambassador that "his actions, his words, his writings, all proved the interest that he took to do everything which could be useful, or even agreeable to his ally." In reply to Napoleon's letter, Alexander reiterated for the 100th time his usual protestations. "I have nothing more at heart than the continuance of the alliance which assures the tranquillity of Europe." He claimed that he was carrying out vigorously the measures against English commerce, as proved by the numerous seizures in his ports; that hardly 60 vessels of different nationalities had arrived lately. Therefore the 600 vessels of which your Majesty speaks will return to England. As a matter of fact, there was no proof that any considerable number of neutral vessels bearing English goods had entered Russian ports. Their principal harbor of refuge was Gothenburg, in southern Sweden, where the quays were piled high with English goods. From this point the merchandise by devious courses found its way to every part of the continent. The closing of the Swedish ports would therefore cut the evil at the root, and Napoleon had even more cause for complaint against Bernadotte than he had against Alexander. The Tsar himself was the first to call attention to this point. In November, 1810, he said to Caulaincourt, "The real port of entry for English and contraband goods is Gothenburg. It is this port which should be closed. If the arrival of the Prince de Pontecorvo deprives England of this outlet, a blow will be struck there which will really be felt in the city of London." At the time he made this statement, Alexander was far from thinking that Napoleon would take him at his word and demand his cooperation in closing Sweden. Therefore he was seriously embarrassed when he received Napoleon's request. He had no desire to increase the enemies of England, and wished to make friends of the Swedes. To him the election of Bernadotte seemed likely to favor this plan. After his arrival in Stockholm, the middle of October, 1810, the Crown Prince had kept his promise to Napoleon so far as to go through the form of declaring war on England, but he had not ordered any confiscations of British goods. He took the first occasion to write the Tsar, in warm terms, to express his desire to live on good terms with his neighbor. This letter confirmed Alexander in his idea that it would not be difficult to transform this jealous lieutenant of Napoleon into a friend and adherent of Russia. While he was hesitating as to the best way of approaching the Crown Prince without arousing the suspicions of the Emperor, the letter of Napoleon furnished him with a good excuse. During his visits to Vienna and Paris, Colonel Tchernicheff had acquired the friendship of Bernadotte, and had made up his mind that the Marshal was jealous and ill disposed toward the Emperor. These impressions he had confided to the Tsar, who decided that this officer was just the emissary he wanted for his mission to the Crown Prince. Alexander accordingly entrusted him with the reply to Napoleon's letter, and ordered him to proceed to Paris by way of Stockholm. In his letter the Tsar explains this détour with his usual art of dissimulation. He writes, "Colonel Tchernicheff having appeared to merit the approval of your Majesty, I am sending him as the bearer of this letter. I am having him pass by way of Stockholm to inform the Swedish government of your desire that I should support the demands made by you, that Sweden shall break with England, although I have the news that this has already been done." On the surface, this letter seemed to fulfill all the obligations which Napoleon had imposed upon his ally. But we know by Tchernicheff's reports that he was charged to inform the Crown Prince confidentially that Sweden was free to take any action she thought best regarding England. In his first private interview with Bernadotte, the Russian envoy saw that he could speak freely, and he stated without any reserve that Russia had no idea of constraining Sweden to act against her own best interests. These words seemed to lift a great weight from the mind of the Crown Prince, who made no effort to conceal his satisfaction. Once started with his Gascon effusion, Bernadotte revealed his innermost thoughts to the envoy. He showed plainly his jealousy of the Emperor, whose greatest crime was that, having been a comrade, he had become a master. Before the interview was over, he assured Tchernicheff upon his "word of honor," in his own name and for the Swedish government, that he would do nothing, under any circumstances, which could in the least degree displease his Majesty of all the Russias. Become entirely a man of the North, his only desire was, to remain always united to Russia. When Tchernicheff left for Paris, Bernadotte charged him with a letter to Napoleon, asking for further time in which to comply with the demands of the Emperor. He was not yet ready to break openly with Napoleon, and gave Tchernicheff as one of his reasons that he was still forced to restrain himself because he was under the necessity of withdrawing the last écu of his possessions in France. The final crisis in the alliance was reached on the 31st of December, 1810, when Russia abrogated the French treaty of the 11th of January, 1787, the only one ever concluded between the two countries, and which had been affirmed by one of the articles of the Peace of Tilsit. This treaty, one of the last and most successful acts of the royal diplomacy, assured the entry into Russia of articles of French manufacture on a privileged basis, and subject only to very moderate duties. Before there was time for the news of this infraction of the treaty to reach Paris, Napoleon, on the 22nd of January, 1811, signed a decree ordering the annexation of Oldenburg to the Empire, and transferring the rights of the ducal family to Erfurt. This territory, which still remained in the hands of the Emperor as part of the spoils of the campaign of Jena, was a sixth the size of the duchy, contained about a third the population, and had a revenue about one half as large. The reigning duke, who strongly protested against this violation of his sovereign rights, was an uncle of the Czar, and his heir had married Alexander's sister, Catherine. This decree also was in violation of the conventions of Tilsit, which provided that the Duke of Oldenburg should be restored to the full and peaceful possession of his states. Both of these infractions of the Treaty of Tilsit were without excuse, and neither Alexander nor Napoleon could plead that his action was taken by way of retaliation, for their acts were practically simultaneous. This time the wrath of the two emperors was mute. It was not manifested by any outbreaks. They both realized that the time for protests had passed, and as they did not wish to precipitate a crisis, they continued to dissemble. At this date Napoleon was not yet ready for war. He had beyond the Rhine only the corps of Davout, about 50,000 strong, which was dispersed throughout northern Germany, and about the same number of Polish troops in the Grand Duchy. He was hoping from day to day to hear that the army of Wellington in Portugal had been forced to embark, and that he could at last withdraw a large part of his veteran troops from the peninsula. His hopes, however, were doomed to bitter disappointment. Messina was held up before the impregnable lines of Torres Vedras, only a few miles north of Lisbon, and the situation was more discouraging than ever. At this same moment Russia was ready for war. Her military preparations, which had been going on for many months, were entirely completed. According to figures given by Alexander himself, with great secrecy he had succeeded in mobilizing and concentrating behind his western frontier 240,500 men, with 124,000 more in reserve. Magazines had been formed, provisions and ammunition brought together, and the army was prepared to enter Poland. Knowing Napoleon's state of unpreparedness, Alexander was strongly tempted to begin the inevitable struggle, and not give the Emperor time to assume the offensive. His plan was to overrun Poland, turn and isolate Danzig, raise Prussia, and appear on the Oder with an army of 330,000 men, which would be raised to over 500,000. If Austria, in view of the advantages which would be offered her, should enter the game against France. But the success of this plan depended upon the attitude of the Poles, who refused all of Alexander's propositions, and remained faithful to Napoleon. Therefore it was abandoned. It is idle now to speculate as to what the result might have been. In all probability it would have been the campaign of 1813 in Germany, with the date set forward by 2 years, and with every advantage in favor of Napoleon, before he had met with the irreparable losses of the disastrous Russian campaign. No one ever knew his trade better than Napoleon, and it was difficult to deceive his vigilance for very long. As early as the month of December he had begun to get wind of the Russian preparations. From that moment he quietly began his own preparations. His first step was to call to the colors the conscripts of 1811, which in a year would give him 400,000 troops ready for service. From this time on his orders followed without interruption or delay. The 3 divisions of Davout were concentrated, and formed the nucleus of a new army of Germany. The defenses of Danzig were strengthened, and war material of every kind was gathered there. But with all possible dispatch he could not be in position to meet the superior forces of Russia before the summer of 1811. Alexander failed, however, to take advantage of the opportunity of assuming the offensive, and passively awaited the coming shock behind his frontiers. 28. 1811. The return of Caulaincourt. In the spring of 1811, after 3 years of brilliant services, Caulaincourt finally obtained his recall. He was to be succeeded by another aide-de-camp of the Emperor, General de Lauriston, an old school companion of Napoleon at Brienne. Alexander expressed great regret at the departure of Caulaincourt, while at the same time speaking in high terms of his successor, whom he had met at Erfurt. In his letter of the 28th of February, Napoleon had written, "I have endeavored to find the person who, I thought, would be the most agreeable to your Majesty, and the best fitted to maintain the peace and the alliance between us. I am very anxious to learn that I have chosen well." To this question the Czar replied affirmatively, and with great goodwill. The new ambassador, Comte de Lauriston, received on the 1st of April the order to leave Paris, and to proceed to his post. His instructions directed him to say to the Czar that the Emperor would make war only under two contingencies: 1. If Russia signed a peace with England, or 2. If she claimed from the Turks an extension of territory beyond the Danube. Lauriston was followed by another letter to be presented to the Czar, in which Napoleon made a strong appeal for a movement of expansion and of confidence; a frank explanation upon both parts, and a sincere attempt to reconcile their differences. For the first time Napoleon admits that he is arming, and maintains that he has the right to do so, because "the news from Russia is not pacific." Napoleon continues, "This is a repetition of what I saw in 1807, 1806 in Prussia, and in 1809 in Austria. As for myself, I shall remain personally the friend of your Majesty, even if that fatality which impels Europe should one day put arms in the hands of our two peoples. I shall not be governed by what your Majesty may do. I shall never attack, and my troops will never advance until your Majesty has torn up the Treaty of Tilsit." At the beginning of 1811, Alexander had made all his arrangements to set his troops in motion against Napoleon. His pretext was the annexation of Oldenburg to the French Empire, but his real reason was the fear that Napoleon, having created and enlarged the Duchy of Warsaw, wished to re-establish the ancient kingdom of Poland. In order to avert this peril, as already stated, he had formed the plan of restoring Poland for his own benefit; and through Czartoryski he had proposed to the Poles to transform the Grand Duchy into a kingdom united to his empire. Much to his surprise, all of his offers were disdainfully rejected. Elsewhere Napoleon rules by force, and only controls the bodies; at Warsaw he reigns over the hearts. It would have been easy for the large Russian army to overrun the duchy, and crush the small Polish forces, but this would delay the invasion, and give Napoleon time to concentrate his troops for the defense of the line of the Oder. The Czar also hesitated to begin hostilities without feeling sure that the far extended flanks of his empire were safe from attack. It was important to ascertain the attitude of Sweden and Turkey. He could not afford to withdraw his army from Finland, recently conquered and annexed, without the assurance that the Swedes would not assume the offensive. In December, 1810, Bernadotte had thrice given his word of honor that he would never declare against Russia, but Alexander had little confidence in this former marshal of the empire. Furthermore, the Crown Prince was not yet the absolute master in his state, and King Charles was known to be friendly to France. On the other flank the war with the Turks continued to occupy a part of the Russian forces, although the Sultan, drained of men and money, did not seem in a position to be a serious menace. Nevertheless, Alexander was anxious to be rid of this adversary, who was more annoying than dangerous. Without the complicity of Austria also, the great plan would be in danger of failure. As the Russians advanced toward the Rhine they would expose their flank to Austria, who could debouch from the Bohemian mountains and cause a disaster. After a long sojourn in Paris, Metternich had returned to Vienna, where he refused to listen to the Russian offers. At the end of January, when Alexander wrote his friend Czartoryski that he had 240,000 troops ready to open the campaign, with 124,000 more in reserve, he swore to Caulaincourt that he had not an extra bayonet in his ranks. These assurances he repeated over and over again. He was a past master in the art of dissimulation, and Caulaincourt believed to the last in his sincerity. "I conceal nothing, and I have nothing to conceal," he repeated frequently, and this alone should have put the ambassador on his guard. "Qui s'excuse, s'accuse." The 1st of March the Russian troops were all ready to begin the invasion of Poland. At this moment Alexander received the most discouraging news. Czartoryski wrote that the commanders of the Polish army and all of the principal magnates were absolutely faithful to Napoleon. At the same time Metternich wrote that any violation of Austrian territory would be considered as a declaration of war, and that the concentration of Russian troops on the frontier of Galicia would end in forcing the Emperor of Austria himself to mobilize his armies and place them upon a war footing. Bad news also came from Stockholm, where Bernadotte reported to be on intimate terms with Elquier, the French minister. In Prussia the king displayed more goodwill than energy, and refused to make a move unless seconded by Austria. In short, on all sides Alexander saw unexpected obstacles develop and bar his route. His resolve to take the offensive was followed by a period of uncertainty. Without entirely giving up his plan, he postponed for the moment its execution. At this time France was represented at Warsaw by a new minister named Bignon, a very active man, full of intelligence and zeal, devoted to the service of the Emperor. The last of March Bignon had 2 long interviews with Poniatowski, who divulged to him the secret projects of the Czar. The prince declined to reveal the sources of his information, but it is certain that he had been approached by the emissaries of Alexander. In a series of almost daily despatches, Bignon communicated to his government all these new developments. Meanwhile, Alexander, discouraged by so many obstacles to his plans, was becoming more and more inclined to look for safety in a systematic defensive. He recalled the words of Barclay after Eylau: "If I were the commander in chief, I should avoid a decisive battle and retire, so that the French, instead of finding a victory, would end by finding a second Poltava." In this spring of 1811, Wellington had furnished a striking example of this Fabian policy, by withdrawing before Messina in southern Portugal until he found refuge behind the impregnable lines of Torres Vedras. The military art is strongly imitative, and this policy was then highly regarded among strategists. At St. Petersburg this doctrine was formulated under the pen of a German in the Russian service, General Pfuel, a brilliant student of the art of war, who excelled in cabinet strategy, but failed in practice. His plan made a strong impression on Alexander, who was now inclined to adopt a purely defensive policy. Leaving St. Petersburg on the 15th of May, Caulaincourt arrived in Paris early on the morning of the 5th of June. He traversed the city, which was in gala attire for the baptism of the King of Rome, and presented himself at St. Cloud, where the court had been in residence for several weeks. He was immediately received by the Emperor in his cabinet, and there ensued a most remarkable interview, the story of which is related in very minute detail in some unpublished memoirs left by the ambassador. The Emperor's greeting was very cold. He immediately began to speak of his grievances against Alexander: his abandonment in 1809, his infractions of the blockade, his armaments. "Alexander is false," he cried. "He is arming to attack me." With great courage, Caulaincourt pleaded the innocence of Alexander and the loyalty of his intentions. He enumerated the services rendered by the Czar, the provocations to which he had been subjected. Napoleon listened with growing impatience. Finally, when Caulaincourt asserted that the Polish offensive was "a ridiculous tale," the Emperor could no longer contain himself. "You are a dupe," he said. "You have not known what was going on. Davout and Rapp have kept me better informed." Nevertheless, Caulaincourt at that moment was nearer correct in his diagnosis of the situation than the Emperor. Alexander had planned to take the offensive, but he was now anxious to avert the war. The ex-ambassador continued to express his convictions with so much warmth and with such evident sincerity, that Napoleon began to be troubled and uncertain. He broke off the conversation and began to pace the room, absorbed in his reflections. A quarter of an hour passed thus in complete silence. Then Napoleon approached Caulaincourt and said: "You believe, then, that Russia does not want war, that she will remain in the alliance, and will re-enter the continental system, if I satisfy her regarding Poland?" In reply, Caulaincourt repeated what he had stated in his despatches; and when pressed to formulate definitely what would satisfy the Czar in regard to Poland, said that a partial evacuation of Danzig and the strong places in Prussia would help the situation. But this idea, before an understanding was reached, did not meet with the Emperor's approval. Returning a little later to the principal question, Caulaincourt maintained that the time had come for the Emperor to adopt one or the other of 2 courses which were possible: either to reassure Russia, by giving an effective guarantee that he would never re-establish Poland; or to reconstitute Poland entirely, by completing the work begun in 1807 and continued in 1809. The first course, if adopted, would avert the war; The second would make it certain, but would furnish an object for which it would be worth while to fight. Each of these plans had its advantages and its disadvantages, but the time had come when it was necessary frankly to choose between them. His words were only a paraphrase of what he had written in one of his last despatches, the 8th of May. The Emperor must choose between Poland and Russia, for matters have come to a point where, not to disillusion the one, is to lose the other. "What course would you take?" demanded the Emperor. "Alliance, prudence, and peace." "Peace? It must be durable and honorable. I do not want a peace like that of Amiens, which ruins my commerce. In order that the peace may be durable, it is necessary that England be convinced that she can find no more auxiliaries upon the Continent." "Your Majesty, then, is inclined toward Poland?" These words arrested the Emperor, and again renewed his perplexity. Poland, feeble and uncertain, would indeed be a fragile barrier, a rampart of sand, against the power of the Colossus of the North. "I do not want war," said Napoleon. "I do not want Poland. But I want the alliance to be useful to me. It has never been so." Caulaincourt once more asserted his belief in the sincerity of Alexander, and spoke with so much warmth and conviction that the Emperor was visibly moved. The ambassador felt encouraged to drive home his argument. At great length he explained that all the acts of the Emperor since 1808 had led the Czar to fear new bouleversements. "Mais quoi?" cried Napoleon. "What designs do they attribute to me? What can I desire? Is not France great enough?" The conversation then wandered into a retrospective discussion, which continued for hours. Again changing the subject, Napoleon began to speak of the Russians. He maintained that the noblesse, corrupt and selfish, after one or two battles lost, as soon as they felt the effects of the invasion, would force the sovereign to sign peace. "Your Majesty is entirely mistaken," said Caulaincourt, boldly. He dared to tell Napoleon that he entirely underrated the defensive strength of the nation. He pointed out what a war in the North would mean, and unveiled in advance its sombre horrors. "In Russia," he said, "they have no illusions regarding the genius of their adversary and his prodigious resources. They know that they will have to encounter a great winner of battles. But they also know that their country is vast, that there is room to retire and give up territory. They know, sire, that it will be to their advantage to draw you into the interior, and to place you at a distance from France and your source of supplies. Your Majesty cannot be everywhere. They will strike only when you are not present. It will not be a war of a day. At the end of a certain time it will be necessary for your Majesty to return to France. Then all the advantages will pass to the other side. Besides, you must take into account the winter, a most severe climate, and above all, a fixed determination never to yield." As a supreme argument, the ambassador quoted the final words of Alexander when he made his adieux. "If the Emperor Napoleon makes war on me, it is possible, even probable, that he will defeat us if we accept the conflict, but that will not give him peace. The Spaniards have been beaten frequently, but they are neither vanquished nor submissive. Furthermore, they are not so distant from Paris, and they have neither our climate nor our resources. We shall not compromise ourselves. We have a space behind us, and we shall keep a well organized army. With that, one is never forced to accept peace, no matter what reverse is experienced. One compels his vanquisher to accept it. The Emperor Napoleon made this remark to Tchernicheff after Wagram. He admitted himself that he would never have consented to treat with Austria if she had not been able to conserve her army. With more persistence, the Austrians would have obtained better conditions. The Emperor must obtain results as prompt as his thoughts are quick. He will never secure them with us. I shall profit from his lessons. They are those of a master. We shall let our climate, our winter, make war for us. The French are brave, but less stubborn than our soldiers. They become discouraged more easily. There will be no prodigies performed except where the Emperor is present. He cannot be everywhere. Besides, he will be forced to return to his States." I will not be the first to draw the sword, but I shall be the last to sheathe it. I will retire to Kamtchatka rather than cede provinces or sign in my conquered capital a peace which will only be a truce." While Caulaincourt was speaking a marked and increasing amazement was depicted on the countenance of the Emperor. He listened to the end without losing a word, as if the veil of the future were withdrawn before his eyes, as if a flash of lightning had revealed the precipice yawning at his feet. He seemed moved, stricken to the bottom of his soul. Caulaincourt felt that he had produced a strong effect, and won his cause. Far from being offended, the Emperor seemed to appreciate his frankness. Napoleon's attitude had changed. His face, which had been hard and cold, became open and kindly. For the first time he thanked Caulaincourt for his zeal, his devotion, and was amiable and familiar. He admitted that the resources of Russia were great, but added that his own were immense. "Bah! A good battle will take the measure of the fine determinations of your friend Alexander and his sand forts." His last words were an allusion to the lines of defense constructed by the Russians between the Dnieper and the Dwina. They had been together since midday. The daylight was fading. Without, in the park, the rays of the setting sun were touching the tops of the trees, and the cabinet was shrouded in gloom, but the Emperor still talked. Finally, after a pause, he said, "It is the Austrian marriage which has embroiled us. Alexander was offended because I did not marry his sister." A strange statement to Caulaincourt, who knew all the facts. Then he corrected himself with the assertion, which could not be denied. "Nevertheless, it is certain that they are upset at Petersburg by our rapprochement with Austria." Finally Napoleon intimated that he was tired out. Notwithstanding this congé, Caulaincourt asked permission to make a final observation, and the Emperor told him to speak. "War and peace are in the hands of your Majesty. For your own happiness and the welfare of France, I implore you to reflect that you are about to make a choice between the drawbacks of the first and the certain advantages of the second." "You talk like a Russian," said Napoleon severely. "No, sire, like a good Frenchman, like a faithful servant of your Majesty. I do not desire war, but I cannot prevent the Poles from wanting me and calling me." Then he went on to say that the Poles in the Russian provinces only awaited a sign from him to rise in revolt. The ambassador maintained that Napoleon was entirely mistaken, and continued audaciously, "Your Majesty cannot deny the fact that they know too well now in Europe that you want nations more for yourself than for their own interests." "You believe that, sir?" "Yes, sire." "You do not spoil me," replied the Emperor in a tone of pique. "It is dinner time." And he retired. The interview had lasted 7 hours. Never had Napoleon listened to such words; never had the danger before him been so clearly indicated. But while the ambassador was correct on many points, on many others he was entirely wrong. His faith in the sincerity and good will of Alexander was without the slightest foundations. Even the sacrifice of Poland would not have brought about an effective co-operation against England, and made the Czar a faithful ally. Nevertheless, if Napoleon had been willing to moderate the demands of his continental system, to accept peace without an alliance, he might have avoided the fatal conflict, for Alexander, although tired of the alliance, certainly did not desire war. In any event, it would have been 1,000 times better for Napoleon to await the war, if inevitable; to let the enemy issue from his frontiers and attack, rather than to go in search of him in these deserts of the north, where more than one illustrious career had already found its tomb. Where Caulaincourt had most clearly shown his wisdom and foresight was in pointing out the dangers and difficulties of an offensive campaign, the disasters which lurked in this course. His predictions of the probable outcome of the Russian campaign were so exact, so definite in all particulars, as to recall the celebrated prophecy of Cassotte at the beginning of the French Revolution. If it were not for the reputation of M. de Caulaincourt as a man of the highest honor and integrity, one would imagine that he, too, was a prophet after the fact; in other words, that his Mémoires were composed in the light of after events. End of chapters 27 and 28.